January 1945. A fortified farmhouse near Bitburg, Germany. Snow covers the frozen mud of the Ardennes foothills, and the air smells of cordite and wet wood. From a second-story window of the stone house, a clean white cloth begins to wave. It moves back and forth in slow, deliberate arcs. An American infantry platoon halts its advance across the open field. The men lower their rifles, breathing sighs of relief. A young lieutenant steps forward into the clearing, his hands raised openly to show he carries no weapon. He calls out a reassuring phrase in German, stepping closer to accept the formal surrender. Then, 30 meters from the door, the cloth vanishes. 3 machine guns open fire at once. General George Patton will answer this ultimate betrayal with a merciless directive that shifts how every American soldier handles the rules of engagement. This is the story of what happened when German forces used a fake surrender to ambush an American platoon, and how General Patton responded to the ultimate betrayal. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what the war revealed when the walls came down. First Lieutenant Kevin O'Malley was 25 years old. He came from Providence, Rhode Island. He led his infantry platoon through the freezing mud of the European theater with a quiet, steady resolve. Before the war, he worked at a small family grocery store on the west side of the city. He enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor because he believed in a clean, fair fight. He had already seen the worst of the winter fighting in the Ardennes, losing his closest childhood friend to an artillery blast outside Malmedy. That loss left him carries a heavy grief, yet he refused to let bitterness harden his heart. Over the past month, his unit had successfully accepted 3 separate German surrenders without firing a single shot. Each time, he had treated the captured men with dignity, offering them hot coffee and dry blankets. He trusted the old rules of engagement because he believed that even in the middle of total warfare, a man's word still meant something. He believed the white flag was an unshakable boundary between combat and peace. That trust carried him across the open snow toward the farmhouse door. Lieutenant Wolfgang Faber was 27 years old. He came from Potsdam, Germany. He commanded the small, desperate remnant of a broken infantry company holding the Bitburg sector. He grew up in an aristocratic family with a long line of Prussian military officers. He wore a tailored wool uniform that remained spotless despite the surrounding filth, and a polished iron cross hung neatly from his collar. Faber viewed the conflict not as a matter of shared human dignity, but as a mathematical calculation of survival and dominance. He held a deep contempt for the American forces, viewing them as soft, undisciplined, and naive. To him, the laws of land warfare were not moral obligations, but legal weaknesses to be exploited when necessary. When the American platoon threatened to overrun his crumbling defensive perimeter, he did not see an honorable surrender as an option. Instead, he saw the white flag as a convenient tactical tool to lure his enemy out of their armored positions and into the open field. He stood behind the reinforced stone wall of the kitchen, counting the seconds as the Americans walked directly into his sights. By January 1945, the European theater had dissolved into a brutal war of attrition along the German border. The massive German counteroffensive in the Ardennes had failed, leaving thousands of their troops cut off, freezing, and running out of ammunition. The German army was collapsing under the weight of its own losses, yet its high command demanded resistance to the absolute bitter end. Small pockets of infantry were left behind in isolated towns and stone farmhouses, ordered to delay the Allied advance at all costs. In this atmosphere of desperation, the standard lines of authority began to fracture. Many German officers chose to surrender their men to save their lives, while others turned to desperate, underhanded tactics to survive. Across the front lines, American units were rapidly advancing through territory they had never seen before, navigating a landscape filled with hidden traps and snipers. Most commanders accept surrenders daily, adhering strictly to the Geneva Convention to process thousands of prisoners smoothly. Some Allied officers had grown relaxed, trusting that a white flag meant the fighting in that sector was over. They had allowed their men to bunch up in the open, assuming the enemy was eager to escape the bitter cold. This leniency had created a dangerous vulnerability that ruthless defenders were eager to exploit. The war had reached a point where the oldest traditions of the battlefield were being tested by men who had nothing left to lose. The silence over the snow-covered fields of Bitburg was about to shatter as the trap snapped shut on the advancing platoon. An American infantry captain approached the secure holding area where the captured German remnants were being detained. He carried a leather folder containing the preliminary battlefield reports from the farmhouse engagement. His jacket was smeared with cold mud, and his face was tight with exhaustion. He walked past the guards and stopped directly in front of the desk where the captured German officer sat. "I am Captain Miller," the American officer said. Faber looked up from his seat, his uniform still neat, and his hands resting calmly on his lap. "I am Lieutenant Faber," the German replied. "You are the commanding officer of the unit that held the stone farmhouse near the Bitburg crossroads," Miller said. "That is correct," Faber said. "Your men displayed a white flag from the upper window of that structure at 1400 hours, Miller said. "It was a necessary measure," Faber said. "A platoon leader and an interpreter walked forward to receive your surrender under that flag," Miller said. "I saw them advance," Faber said. "You ordered your machine guns to fire when they reached 30 meters, Miller said. "They walked into a defensive engagement zone," Faber said. "They walked into a trap because they respected the white flag," Miller said. "In warfare, one must use every available method to delay an overwhelming force," Faber said. "The white flag is not a method," Captain Miller said, his voice rising slightly as he leaned over the desk. "It is a universal signal protected by every law of land warfare. You used it to execute 7 men who were trying to spare your lives." Faber offered a thin, cold smile and smoothed the fabric of his sleeve. "The laws of warfare are written by those who have the luxury of numbers," Faber said. "My position was nearly overrun by your armor. I did not have the luxury of an honorable retreat. I used the flag to draw your infantry away from their support vehicles and into a pre-registered kill zone covered by my heavy weapons. It was a highly effective defensive action. You murdered a lieutenant who was walking toward you with his hands in the air," Miller said. "It was a legitimate tactical deception," Faber said. "The American army is far too soft for this stage of the struggle. If your officers choose to trust a piece of cloth before securing a perimeter, that is a failure of your training, not a crime of my command. I saved the lives of my surviving men by neutralizing your lead element." "This is not a deception," Captain Miller said, closing the leather folder with a sharp snap. "This is perfidy. It is a specific war crime under the statutes of international law. You are not a combatant anymore. You are a criminal." Faber leaned back in his chair and crossed his legs. "You may call it whatever your regulations require," Faber said. "I am a regular officer of the line, and I demand the treatment due to my rank. Your paperwork does not change the reality of the field." Captain Miller looked at the German officer for a long moment, noting the complete lack of blood or mud on his boots. He turned toward the door without another word. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His command jeep pulled up to the brick gatehouse, the metal tires crunching sharply against the frozen gravel. 4 polished stars gleamed on his helmet, and the ivory-handled revolvers rested firmly on his belt. He stepped out of the vehicle with a calm, deliberate stride, his winter coat buttoned tightly to the chin. Every soldier in the guardroom snapped to attention immediately. The room became completely silent as the general walked inside, his boots echoing against the concrete floor. He did not raise his voice. He did not look angry. He simply walked over to the desk where the German officer sat and looked down at him with cold, heavy eyes. "Are you the officer who ordered the machine guns to fire under the white flag?" Patton asked. "I am the commander of that sector," Faber answered. "Did you understand that the Americans were advancing to receive your surrender?" Patton asked. "They were advancing into our defensive perimeter," Faber answered. "Did you rehearse the timing of the flag with your gunners?" Patton asked. "We prepared our positions thoroughly," Faber answered. Patton studied the German for a long moment, his hands resting on his belt near the ivory grips. He took a slow breath, his voice remaining quiet, but carrying an undeniable weight through the small room. You believe you have executed a clever piece of infantry business. You sit there in your clean wool uniform and call it a tactical deception, because it saved your skin for a few more weeks. You think the rules of land warfare are a luxury for the strong. The truth is much simpler. You committed a common crime. You took the oldest symbol of human trust on a battlefield and you turned it into a slaughter pen. You did it because you were desperate, and you did it because you are a coward who cannot face defeat with honor. 15 meters from your door lies an American lieutenant from Rhode Island. He had a family, a home, and a future. He accepted 3 real surrenders last month because he believed that even in this total war, a man's word still meant something. He died because he treated you like an honorable soldier. A fake surrender does not just kill the men who fall for it. It poisons the entire front. It makes every soldier hesitate the next time a real surrender happens. Because of your clever tactic, German soldiers who genuinely want to give up will be shot in the mud. You have murdered your own countrymen along with my infantrymen. You have a choice now. You will sign the full confession detailing your perfidy, or you will face the immediate consequences of an unlawful combatant. Decide now. Faber looked at the general, his face tightening as his absolute certainty began to crack under the cold gaze of the commander. He slowly reached for the pen. The signed confession was immediately dispatched to 3rd Army headquarters, but Patton did not wait for the military courts to convene a formal tribunal. He issued a dynamic directive that was transmitted by radio and courier to every combat unit under his command. The order was read aloud by company commanders to thousands of muddy, shivering infantrymen standing in the snow across the Bitburg sector. Patton did not order the execution of the captured prisoners, but he completely rewrote the tactical reality of the front line. The new field protocol dictated that any future white flag would be treated as an active combat threat until proven otherwise. American infantrymen were ordered to maintain heavy covering fire on all windows and defensive slits while an enemy approached. The accepting party was strictly forbidden from advancing into open space or potential kill zones. Instead, the surrendering forces were required to exit the structure entirely, strip off their heavy equipment, and advance with their hands raised, while the Americans remained securely behind hard cover. The surrendering party was forced to crawl through the frozen mud toward the American lines to be searched. German soldiers who had watched the farmhouse trap snap shut saw their own comrades forced into the freezing dirt. The absolute security of the white flag was broken, replaced by a cold, operational necessity that protected the soldier first. First Lieutenant Kevin O'Malley never returned to the grocery store on the west side of Providence. He remained in the cold soil near Bitburg, his name engraved on a plain white cross in a military cemetery. His family received the standard telegram in late February, but it was years before the surviving men of his platoon traveled to Rhode Island to tell his mother the truth about the farmhouse door. They brought with them his brass whistle and a tarnished silver medal, the only items salvaged from his field jacket before the ground froze solid. He died 15 meters from the piece he tried to build, leaving behind a platoon that would never look at a white cloth the same way again. Lieutenant Wolfgang Faber spent the remainder of the European struggle behind the high wire of an officer detention facility in western France. He was convicted of perfidy during a military tribunal in late 1946, his own signed confession serving as the primary evidence against him. He served a 10-year sentence before being released during the Reconstruction era, returning to a ruined Potsdam where his family crest was buried under brick and ash. He lived out his remaining years working as a clerk in a municipal transit office, completely forgotten by the men he once commanded. He died in 1978, still insisting to his few acquaintances that his actions at the farmhouse were justified by the desperation of the perimeter. General Patton never mentioned the Bitburg farmhouse directive in his public statements or press conferences. He kept a carbon copy of the emergency surrender protocol locked in the lower drawer of his field desk until the final surrender in May, In a brief journal entry written 2 days after the incident, he noted that the true tragedy of warfare was not the destruction of buildings, but the erosion of the ancient codes that kept men from becoming beasts. He wrote that when a soldier weaponizes the symbol of peace, he kills more than his immediate enemy. He kills the very possibility of mercy. Some historians have argued that Patton's harsh directive regarding the white flag was an excessive measure that increased the brutality of the final months of the war. They suggest that treating a symbol of surrender as a potential threat compromised the basic rules of engagement and led to unnecessary casualties on both sides. Others have argued the opposite, maintaining that the general's decisive action was the only logical way to protect his troops from perfidy. They believe that by establishing clear, defensive parameters for accepting surrenders, he preserved the lives of his infantrymen. What is certain is that the Bitburg farmhouse incident fundamentally altered Third Army field protocols until the German capitulation. If you had been in General Patton's position, would you have rewritten the battlefield protocols to protect your infantry, or would you have maintained the traditional rules of engagement to preserve the absolute sanctity of the white flag? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more stories about what the war revealed when the walls came down, make sure to subscribe.